Good evening, everyone. My name is Julian Schwarzenbach. I'm the chair of the BCS Data Management Specialist Group, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight to tonight's webinar. Before we introduce our speaker, what I'd like to do is just do a very quick announcement about our following event, just so you're aware of what we've got coming up. And that is on the 18th of March, Keith Strachan from NHS Digital will be presenting a webinar on data in social care. So he's been doing a lot of work there, and he's leads quite a bit of initiatives in that area. So that if you've got any interest in healthcare data or data generally, that should be a really good event to come along to. Anyway, that's the end of the public service announcement. I'd like to hand over to my fellow committee member, Ed Evans, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Ed, over to you.
Thanks, Julian. Welcome everybody to tonight's talk. Gavin, I'm going to introduce Gavin in a moment. We'll be talking about Open Energy, which is an initiative to use the power of shared data to transform the UK energy industry. So Open Energy is an Icebreaker 1 project aiming to revolutionise the energy sector in the same way that open banking, if you're familiar with open banking, a regulated way to give companies access to financial data to transform the finance sector. So it's about working with organisations to more easily exchange information with particular emphasis on phasing out fossil fuels and developing effective implementation of renewable technology, so enabling innovation in particular. So there's a lot of questions about open data, which I'm sure that some of which will be answered this evening. So we're going to introduce Gavin. So thanks very much, Gavin, for giving your time this evening. So Gavin Starks is the founder and CEO of Icebreaker 1, which is the company that's leading Open Energy, or founded Open Energy. The founder of Icebreaker 1, Gavin has founded and funded and run over a dozen organisations, including the CEO of the Open Data Institute, which you might be more familiar with. He's the co-chair of the Open Banking Standard and CEO of the global environmental intelligence company, AMEE, A-M-E-E. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Gavin. Just to say, questions, we'll be taking questions as we go along. Gavin wants interaction as much as possible, so please fire the questions along, and Julian and I can pass them on to Gavin. So thanks very much. Away you go, Gavin.
Thanks very much, Ed, and good to connect with everyone this evening. I'd like to keep this very interactive if we can. So as I'm going through this, and any questions that pop into your head, please do just drop them into the systems here, and we'll pick them up, and I'll try and weave them in. We've got a dedicated Q&A session at the end as well, for a bit more of a structured conversation. So just by way of introduction, again, my name is Gavin Starks, founder of Icebreaker 1. We're an independent non-profit, and our mission really is to make data work harder to deliver net zero. And what we're really building on here is a number of different tracks. One is the huge explosion of data around the world, from sensors, Earth observation. Every system is producing data in some kind of form, and there's a massive latency between that and our governance structures and the legal structures and the operational structures that can actually help us make the most of it. And over the last 5 years, there's been quite a remarkable shift with the implementation of the Open Banking Standard in the UK, which I helped to co-chair back in about 5 years ago. And that's now across the entire banking sector. There's about 500 fintech companies signed up to it. And what I'm going to do this evening is just walk through a little bit about what Icebreaker is doing to give you a bit of context, and then really do go into quite a lot of detail about what we're doing with the Open Energy program and how that can pave the way for more data interoperability, what I call our data infrastructure approach, which I think will become more and more relevant as we go forward. So just to kind of recap here, we're very focused on the climate issue, but one of the big challenges there is everyone who's trying to address net zero, who's trying to drive towards net zero, is they're trying to make decisions about how to deploy capital, how to deploy their organizations, how to work out who's green, who's not. I think over the last 18 months or so, pretty much everyone in finance has added the word green to their business card, but nobody's quite sure still what it means. At the same time, you've got national and international frameworks in flight to mandate carbon disclosure or climate risk disclosure, which starts to move it very much into a financial driver, an economic driver. And obviously the UK this year is the chair of the COP, the climate conference. So there's a lot of activity around this area, and this is linked, in fact, to part of the national strategy that has been run by UKRI around trying to drive everybody towards net zero, and that has a deep relevance to the open energy work. Give you a bit more insight about Icebreaker 1 and where we're coming from. We're a very young organization. We're 9 months old. We started trading in Q2 of last year with a UKRI grant and European grants. We've got a very interesting advisory board, which includes Ian Graham from the Scale Up Institute, Volker Buscher is the Chief Data Officer at Arup, through to Bryony Worthington, who helped create the Climate Change Act more than a decade ago, and Celeste Connors, who is Obama's climate security advisor. So we're really trying to bring together these areas of industry, policy, and climate and data in the heart of it. As well as our team, while we only were 2 of us, I think this time last year, we've got a core team of about 20 people now, and an extended family of about 130 as we've scaled up to deliver some of the projects that we've been working on over the last 9 months. We've also been working with our commercial partners. So just again, to give you a sense of the pace that things are moving at right now, we've got some of the large insurance companies like Aon and Lloyd's Register Foundation, universities, Edinburgh and Cambridge, as well as SMEs, legal firms and so on. So this is not a kind of fringe activity, I would say, for organizations. It's really front and center of how people are thinking about their data strategy and how they're thinking about their financial strategy as we move into a high risk climate change driven world. But let's take a step back from this and talk about the data, which I'm sure why most of you are here. At the Open Data Institute, we created a framework called the Data Spectrum. And the Data Spectrum tried to simplify the language around data into 3 words. That was either open, shared, or closed. Obviously, at the Open Data Institute, we were very focused on open data, and that is data, we defined it as data that anyone can use for any purpose for free. So clearly that applies to certain data. It does not apply to lots of other data. So within the open banking context, for example, someone's personal data, their bank statements, would never be considered to be open, but they would be considered to be shared or closed. The focus, or primary focus for Icebreaker 1 is to look at this shared data space. The way that a lot of data is shared at the moment is pretty chaotic and very high friction. There's lots of bilateral contracts that organizations sign with each other to help share information, but there's no or very few instances where there's standard terms. So here, if you like, there's one way of thinking about this is how can we create a preemptive license for data such that many organizations can lean in and really reduce that transactional friction to data sharing. With, again, framing this in the context of open banking, the open banking standard, which was initiated by Treasury and is now regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, mandates that data must be shared to a common standard. So there's a degree of cohesion and interoperability across the entire market. It mandated that all of the financial institutions involved must have an open API, an open application interface, in order to share information, and it should be the same across all of the different vendors. So that enables both the supply and the demand side. So people were sharing data prior to the open banking standard, but they were doing so, shall we say, ineffectively. There were lots of different ways of doing it. and there wasn't a lot of standardization. But if you're a startup trying to engage with the entire financial sector and you've got to do hundreds of different integrations, that's a massive investment, a massive barrier to innovation, which the open banking standard helps to address. But the question that arises immediately there is, if you're a bank, for example, and you want to share information with a fintech company, well, how can you trust them? How do you know they are who they say they are? So there's a kind of know your customer KYC sort of process, and how can you manage that within a framework that you also don't have to deal with hundreds of fintech companies? So there, you don't want to be doing lots of bilateral contracts. You just want one way of doing things. So what the open banking standard achieved is that level of cohesion and interoperability across the financial sector. And because the Financial Conduct Authority is regulating it, it forces the hand of the market. Now, the organizations that are regulated are just the banks. But because all of the banks are regulated to do this in a common way, cohesive way, it means all the fintech companies have to also sign up to it too. There's two components to that. One is a kind of regulatory framework, and then there's actually a technology component in there that helps us manage how all of these organizations deal with each other. So what I'll be doing in a moment is just going through how we've taken some of that thinking over to energy, but I also want to just give a bit of a sense of the scope here. When we think about climate, and when we think about our national infrastructure, and when we think about data, this kind of thinking, we strongly believe, is going to apply across sectors. So energy is the first out of the gate, really, but it equally will apply to transport, to water, to the built world, and to agriculture, which are the primary clusters within the Icebreaker framework. These are the things that have the greatest impact on our environment and on climate change. So if you like, climate change is our sort of diamond bit on the end of the drill here to try and provide the use cases and the evidence as to why this is important and why this approach is essential. So a bit of an example is quite a complex chart, but it kind of illustrates how difficult it is currently to share information. So at the heart of what we're doing, we're trying to understand user needs and how do people create data, how do they acquire it, how do they combine it, how do they transform it and analyze it. And within the climate realm, we're looking at asset level information. So that could be financial data, it could be digital twins, that's geospatial information about land usage, it's the environmental data. So if a data center exists within a city, for example, what's the environment that it's sitting within and what are the dependencies on that? What's the climate data, again, in the context of its impact on these financial systems, and what's the regulatory framework around that. So when you start unpacking that from, again, looking through this sort of climate lens, there's lots of people at one end who want to do planning. So a local authority, for example, looking to do planning for their own area and wanting to look at flood risk, what's the building stock, what's the scientific evidence of what might happen in their area, what are the ways that they could mitigate that. There's a whole range of questions that become incredibly complex very quickly. They rely then on risk modeling to identify what the environment might look like, and then they're obviously looking at how they do capital allocation. So how do we create financial instruments here that drive behaviors? All of these things together give a huge number of opportunities for organizations to create change. But then the common call that I've heard across hundreds of meetings that I've been in over the last many years now, over a decade, is bring us the data. And so our question then is, well, which data, for what purpose, for which user, and why, and so on. And then you get into an infinity of conversations about metadata and taxonomies and ontologies and etc. The focus for Icebreaker is this, there's a little layer here in the middle which is critical, which is we don't hold any data whatsoever. We also don't want to design a taxonomy ever. What we do focus on are what are the rules for access to data? How can we enable people to find it, access it, and use it? Now, those three words sound pretty straightforward, and obviously on the web we've been able to search for access and use information very easily for a long time. But when it comes to that shared data landscape, where the data can't be open, there has to be a permission process. So there has to be a mechanism for publishing data in a way that is secure and where the parties know what the permissions are across the ecosystem. So what I'm going to do now is just sort of step through some of the context of the projects we've been working on here. So we're looking at how we can get access from organizations, from assets, from sensors, Earth observation data, regulatory information, research and science. We've got 3 programs that have been looking at this in terms of financial instruments, in terms of economic modeling for net zero, recovery from COVID. How do we stimulate the economy into a green future? And open energy is kind of part of the foundations of this. And we do that very much by convening people around these rapid innovation programs. You know, scaling from 2 to 130 people in 6 months is indicative of the sort of pace of change here. And then to try and implement the data governance around this. So with that as a bit of a preamble, I'm now going to walk through the elements of open energy and what we've built over the last 6 months and the direction of travel. So I'll just pause there and see if any questions come in. Please do ask questions as I go along. So our question, just to give a bit of context, open energy was an outcome from an SBRI competition, which is a national competition called MEDA. So Modernizing Energy Data Access competition. So it was a very competitive process. There were dozens of applicants for phase 1. We got through that. There were a number of actors in phase 2, and we just announced 2 weeks ago that we've won the overall competition. So we're now going ahead to take this to market over the next 6 months. So again, that pace of change, an important component. The 2 elements of what we're trying to build here, one of them is an energy data search engine, which is now live on our website, which is energydata.org.uk. And the second is an open energy governance platform for the data itself. So what we're building here, and it's still very much in flight, is an open standard to enable a marketplace for data sharing to flourish. Very much aligned with all of the work that's being done on open banking, and the FCA is now extending that into open finance, covering pensions, investments, and so on. But how can we build on the existing work to enable data discovery, access, and use? So I'm going to move forward how we're applying this, and it really starts with stakeholder engagement. And so our use case here is really critical. So we've got a local authority and we've got an end user who's trying to apply or work out how they're going to apply low carbon technologies to their area. So for example, they may want to find out, can they install a different form of heating or energy supply to a particular area. And in order to do so, they need to know everything about the built environment. They need to know the capacity of the local energy grids. They need to know the potential demand for electric vehicles as we electrify our national transport infrastructure. And so how do they go about that at the moment? Well, at the moment, I'd say there's a lot of either high-end consultancy where people have to come in and do a huge amount of desk research. And there's within that also a lot of spreadsheet sharing that's incredibly prevalent. So how can we make it easier for that user to search for what data even exists and therefore what doesn't? How can they license that information when it's shared data? If it's an open license, that's easy. But if it's a shared license, what is the license? How can they access it? And then how can they use it? So here we create a number of different types of actor. We've mapped out over 8,000 energy companies in the UK, or companies related to the energy sector rather. And we call them energy data service providers. So all of the organizations in that ecosystem will be either consumers of or providers of data. Within the framework of the national competition, they've now launched an application strand to that as well, called MedApps, which is how can the startups and innovators build applications on top of a data ecosystem We'll also see data aggregators and analytics providers, but I think you can see from the sort of mind map that we've done in the middle there, it's kind of knowledge graph of the different providers, is a decentralized ecosystem of data providers is what exists. And so we need an ecosystem here that's going to support a decentralized data architecture. And obviously the most successful data architecture in history is the web. So we need to make the rest of the ecosystem work the way the web works. And for me, one of the reflections on open banking was it was really one of the first times we'd got policy to act the way that the web works and supports that in a very material manner. So when we look at how can we provide access, here you might have an organization like SSE, Scottish and Southern, who is a data provider, and there's thousands of different providers there, and there's also thousands of different users. You might have someone like Schneider Electric as a user, or Arup, or indeed Scottish and Southern itself. How can we provide the governance structure around that is really at the heart of our questions here. What does authentication look like? What rights exist? How do we manage liability? And how do we manage compliance in a completely machine readable manner? So the data here that needs to exist, it tends not to exist, and there are no sort of machine readable contracts and lots of interesting themes around things like distributed ledger technologies and things like that, which I'm not going to touch on today, other than to say we don't need a DLT or a blockchain in order to achieve this. What we found in our work is, first of all, engagement with our stakeholders was really important. We had over 60 industry stakeholders across the advisory groups, providing input into how the industry actually works under the hood, as well as how it's supposed to work. And the first part of that was to validate our use case. And so the use case was very much driven by industry defined needs. Everybody needed to know exactly that sort of user story. How do you unpack that in something people can really relate to? So here, as I said, we had this local authority use case where they're looking to retrofit with low carbon technologies. How do they get information out on the current estate that they're looking at, ranging from taking out gas boilers and electric storage heaters, replacing them with solar PV arrays and so on? How can they make this the real investment case around this? And so here we've got an application provider which we invented for the purpose of this use case, called Retrofitly, to enable the user to select an area and find the data that she needs, and then do the modeling they need to to understand the implications of their investment decisions and potential plans. So with that as a kind of anchor use case, we then went on to the first step of the program, which was how can they search for data in the first place. So this is a screenshot of the search engine. You can go to that, to the URLs at the top of the page. So critically here, you can search for any data. It's using a CCAN instance. It's pretty straightforward. You can see there's lots of different results. But what you can do is you can filter then on both open data and on shared data. And you can see the padlock piece there, which is sort of illustrating that this is not open data. And what you can then filter down on is by region and by license. So that enables the user to understand what exists at a very high level. And a critical component of this then is that organizations must publish openly licensed, so open data, metadata about the data that they hold. And if they don't do that, it's not going to be searchable. There's a fundamental principle here that data increases in value the more it's connected. And if we can't find the information, we can't connect it. So it's not going to generate much value. So one of the things we learned from the energy sector was that the metadata may or may not exist. There may or may not be systems which enable the end organizations to publish whether or not publish their own metadata. So we provided two mechanisms. One is where the host organization who's holding their own data can publish metadata, and then we can find it. Or if they can't do that, then we can enable them to publish metadata directly within the system. So hopefully self-evident to the people on this call, if you don't have metadata, you can't find things and we're a bit stuck. So I think that we really illustrated that using that it's very straightforward. We were able to spin up the basics of an energy data search within the second phase of this program. It took, within it was about a 6-week window from start to finish. We're then looking at the next piece here about the open energy governance platform. We need to show how we could enable authentication and access to shared data. One of the major differences between open banking and open energy is that open banking was based around a very simple use case. Customer bank statements or SME bank statements and the banking products. And there were things like where are the ATMs and things like in the mix. With energy, there's a million use cases. This is going right away from smart meters to the flexibility market in a local area, right the way through to how does the wind turbine work, or what's its output in on a particular site. So when you look at that diversity of use case, we could say, well, let's make all the data open. That's not secure. There's lots of risks around it. You can't just say, well, everything should be open to all people. That has lots of consequences. We could build a single portal where all the data gets put, but I'd say that is toxic to most market vendors. They want to hold on to their data and have it in their own organizations. There's no way competing organizations are going to put all their data into a third party in order to enable that third party to then monetize it and make it shareable. So I think there's a real market resistance to portals. There's a real desire for central authorities and governments and the EU and so on and so forth to build portals. They love it because it feels like a nice central place, but it's not the solution that works in the market. Third option there, looking at bilateral contracts, just doesn't scale. If you've got 8,000 organizations in an ecosystem, they're all trying to share data with each other. Well, I'll leave it to the audience to work out how many permutations of bilateral contracts you've got there. So we look here then to a governance platform that tries to centralize and standardize the authentication piece and the authentication piece only. So here in our example, the application vendor here says, can we get data from different providers so they can search for data providers? And in centerpiece here, they've found 3 different data providers, and they can provide the authentication and connect into each data provider directly. And what this addresses is who is allowed to join the ecosystem, what roles have they got, what are the security components around that. It does the KYC piece, so they absolutely can guarantee that it's the right person receiving the data at the other end, and you've got access control. These things might sound quite straightforward from a technology point of view. Giving permissioned access to a piece of data is something that is a well-trodden path. But around this, we've got to build the rest of the ecosystem. So we've got to move from a multi-connection piece here to a standardized way of connecting everybody to the same rules. And it's really where we talk about those rules that we get into the interesting pieces. So here, the Open Energy Governance Platform holds the validated credentials. So there's an onboarding process, a KYC process. It contains the roles and the authorizations and the signposting to where the APIs are. And critically, they can be revoked. So as the data supplier, you can revoke access to a particular vendor, and that's backed up contractually. We're working as well with Ofgem to work out what components of this could or should be regulated. So what we found is that the access to shared data can be closely controlled within this trust framework, and we can give very granular permission for different types of user to different types of data. And this granularity of control, I think, is really where there's going to be a lot of interest. But it's not just a technology problem. As I was saying, this is something that's going to require policy and regulatory intervention. There's currently no defined roles and responsibilities within this ecosystem, so we need to create them. Open banking was very much led by Treasury. Open energy is currently being driven by the private sector itself, with Ofgem as an active observer in the process at the moment. We're working with them to work out what that should look like. The incentives here are right at the heart of it. We have to address the question, what's in it for me, for the commercial vendors. There's an absolute cultural tendency to not share information. The default for any organization and lawyer is to say, well, I'm very happy if everybody else opens up access to their information, but we want to receive the value, not deliver it. So there's an idea here at the heart of it, really, of reciprocity has to be a driving force here in terms of making it clear to the everybody in the ecosystem that there is value either in efficiencies or in reducing risk or in creating new innovation that is going to come out the other end of this. So again, when we look at the differences, most of the things in open banking do translate. The things that really don't are the API standards themselves. There is no, and there won't be one technical solution for all cases and data types for energy. So the trust framework here has to link multiple APIs that will be defined across industry. So part of our role here is to bring people together to really help them understand and choose which APIs are going to work for their particular use cases. So the evolution here, and we're looking at this through the lens of an application developer or a user, is both of those people want to find data and work out how they can access and use it in either in their development or in their analysis. And here the trust framework, the Open Energy Governance Platform, can manage that process of saying, yes, you can be authorized for access and use of data in development as an application provider, or as an end user where you want to access data and use it in analysis. And just those two use cases on their own already create a huge headache in the way that bilateral contracts are done today. So what we found here is a really substantial amount of open energy can be reused. We understand the sector-specific needs of the energy sector and are moving forward really on this preemptive licensing approach. So just to getting near the end now. So what are we doing over the next 6 months? So we're going to keep building out the Open Energy Governance Platform, moving it from a private beta to a public beta. We're going to basically work through and evidence the use case that we created in phase 2. We're going to implement. And that will also mean that we'll move forward with the energy data search and the business model around this. We are a non-profit, which we're designing this whole program around for the sector, by the sector, so that it's business relevant to the needs of the market and to the needs of society through our interactions with the regulator. So that process then is going to involve a steering group and then different industry advisory groups looking at delivery and membership. We've got the use case there around the local authority, which I've mentioned today, but we're also looking at an engineering consultancy, household smart meter information, and electric vehicles as parallel development tracks. And everything is going to be on our energydata.org website. We've got some webinars coming up in the next week or so around our next step of plans. But really, the scope here is huge. So we've looked at electric vehicles. That includes personal data, consumer consent, open data, shared data. It's cross-sector. We're looking at engineering problems like natural gas type hydrogen, which involves business-to-business consent, industrial data. But we've had a huge expression of interest from the markets with some incredible organizations leaning into this. So we're very excited about this, because the bit that we can really address here is the search, licensing and access piece, unlocking the huge potential of the application vendors to go and build things by making it easier for them to access stuff in the first place, while making sure that everybody in the data supply side is getting the value that they need to see out of the other end of this, whether they're charging money for it or whether they're charging for reciprocity in the mix. There needs to be a value exchange that works for everyone in this. So I'm just going to finish off with one other pointer for those interested, which we also just published a paper on data infrastructure, which outlines this market design for data sharing. It's very focused on non-financial data, and what walks through a lot of those use cases. So there's a link on the page at the moment. If you do go to the website, if you just go to research and then publications, it's the first link there as well. So I'm going to stop there. I think I said I'd stop at 7:20, and it's exactly that time. And we can break open for questions.
Thank you, Gavin. That was really interesting, really excellent, and it sounds like there's some real groundbreaking work going on there. Just wondering about global comparators. How does this approach compare to what's being done elsewhere in the world?
Well, I think the UK really took a massive lead on the open banking initiative, and because through the process we created when we were first designing it, we mandated that everything in open banking would be openly licensed itself. So the open banking standard is an openly licensed standard. Mm-hmm. With the view to make it easy for other countries to copy. I think we underestimated how quickly they were going to do that. New Zealand were the first, the flag, if you like. They copied over 90% of what we did in the UK. They copied over to New Zealand and have implemented in the New Zealand market within 2 years of the UK publishing its work. So actually, from a policy and industry point of view, that's lightning speed. Similarly, Canada, Bahrain, but there's dozens of countries around the world now implementing open banking in some form. What we're hoping to do here, from our perspective, this is the first at-scale implementation or experiment, if you like, with applying that thinking outside of the financial sector. So our hope is here, if we get this right, so even get this half right, we'll help everyone work out how to do non-financial data sharing at scale. And I think what we've been very careful in the mix here to align the work we're doing with the UK's national data strategy and the smart data strategy, which are currently two different tracks, but they're coming together, I'd say, in terms of their principles. So we've taken a lot of these blueprints and said, look, let's just make sure the blueprints themselves are open, because there's so much value to generate on top of this. So I think, again, I mentioned New Zealand because New Zealand's also the first in touch with us about open energy as a potential other implementation at a country level.
Yeah, oh, that sounds interesting. So thank you. And you mentioned there the parallels with open data. I mean, are there some benefits on the open banking side of things that are immediately transferable through to open energy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if I was to really pick out a few of the key things, one is to anchor around a use case, like a very specific use case. The more specific the use case, the more likely it is that everybody will have a clue what you're talking about. And when you hit the barriers, we can step through the particular blockers on that particular use case and actually work out where are the benefits, where are the potential harms, and how do we navigate and mitigate those. I think there's a lot of, again, I've been in many dozens of meetings where there's lots of fear of the unknown, and you can't really navigate through fear of the unknown in a generalized way. You need to do it in a very specific way and say, well, how about for exactly this use case? Is it a problem? Quite often you can work through that, but it takes time. So the other critical thing there is to have everybody at the table. It takes longer, as all those processes do, when you try and involve everyone. But if you have people in the overall organizations in the overall ecosystem who are very anti data sharing, or what they have a particular way that they want to do it that isn't joined up with everybody else, it just grinds the whole thing to a halt. So you've got to include everybody. And so having the regulator at the table from the outset is very important, both from a signaling point of view and from a pragmatic point of view, because really we want to shorten the path here between policy and operations. And then finding, one of the reasons we have climate change as a forcing function here is that's the use case that we all need to fix. If we don't fix that, other things happen that are not going to be very good for it. So it's a good one to keep the momentum going on those slightly darker days as well.
Yeah, good, thank you. And a question from Nigel, which I'm going to sort of build on a little bit, of if people want to go beyond shared data and onto closed data, does this, what's being proposed here, in fact, provide a pathway to facilitate that and make that easier to deliver?
Sure, I think there's a natural tipping point here where we say, although it's not an absolute, there's no line you can draw, where there's a collective action need, where you've got a many-to-many relationship. If you've got dozens of organizations as suppliers and dozens of organizations as consumers of data, you need some kind of shared data infrastructure. Otherwise, everyone's got to do hundreds of bilateral contracts. If there's 3 of you, you don't need a shared data infrastructure. Just do it the way you're doing it today. If you're just trying to share this set of data with this one other institution, fine. Don't change what's if it's not broken, we don't need to fix it. So it's really about how do we do this at scale. And when you look at the complexity, and this is the thing that the Martha Lane Fox had a great quote, like, today's the simplest it's going to be. So when we look at the energy market, we're no longer in a position where there's a very small number of energy providers and a fairly understandable and clear, simple number of energy users. It's a very diverse and fragmented marketplace with lots of microgeneration. And as we try and gear up and work out how we're going to deliver electric transport at scale, it's going to be that load balancing exercise is going to be even more complex. So it's really where there's the many-to-many relationship that is our focus.
Thinking a little bit more on the sort of the journey into the closed data side, so taking away from the technical side, do you think in terms of the commercial and some of the agreements and the legal side, does that provide a pathway through to just facilitate the agreements and letting parties sort of authenticate each other before they get into the closed data space?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that the work we do here to try and just seemingly simple things, which I think as a former scientist have always been a bit perplexing, is we keep reinventing the same legal terms over and over again, putting them in PDF files, and then somehow making them unique to the point that somebody has to check spelling and capitalization. It does seem a bit inefficient. So I'd hope that some of the frameworks that we create here would help to standardize the things more at the closed end in such a way that people might say, actually, we thought there was only a market of 5 people who wanted this information. Actually, it's 50 or it's 500 or it's 5,000. So the incentive that we're trying to unpack here is, if we come back to this kind of mantra I have, data increases in value the more it's connected. If we can at least say, just publish the metadata about what you've got, then other people, your customers will find it. And we're still a very long way away from that in 2021. The kind of foundations of what made the web work and what makes the web work hasn't translated into the physical realm yet. And this is part of that journey.
So you mentioned metadata there. There's a question from Alan, and also I'd also got one in the back of my mind about the fact that if you haven't got an agreed taxonomy how are you going to make sure the metadata is provided and actually is workable in this ecosystem?
Completely. So I come back to the don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There are thousands of metadata projects, and they probably nest into thousands of other things. So part of it, picking the use case here, is to say, and the difficult job of getting everybody in the room is to say, look, what's good enough for this use case? Let's pick it and say it's that one, and then everybody has to do that one, and let's do that for the next year. And see what happens, and iterate from that point. Now, the good thing about metadata standards is you can publish, as long as they're openly licensed, as long as you can get to the metadata, there's a whole raft of business opportunities in there as well for doing the aggregation. You know, aggregators don't go away in this landscape. They actually become more important because they can start to harmonize all of the different ways of doing it. I've got a great use case there. One of the companies that I incubated at the Open Data Institute is called Transport API. And they just sit at the layer between lots of different transport providers like Transport for London and thousands of developers. And their primary role is to take in all the different data feeds and make it usable in a common API framework. That's the direction of travel here. And I think we can't, there's never one ring to rule them all. I think maybe is but then we can at least provide the authentication layer between here, and everyone can fight over which taxonomy they want to use at a different layer of the stack.
Yeah, interesting you mentioned Transport API. I actually did a project with them about 18 months ago, but yeah, I mean, that's probably a similarly complex, slightly anarchic ecosystem they're trying to address. So yeah, it's an interesting one there. Just a quick reminder to the audience, if you've got questions, post them in the question box and I will ask them on your behalf to Gavin. So we've just had one come in from Paul, which I think works quite nicely. He's sort of interested in terms of all the use cases that you've described, very much on the downstream side. What about the upstream side on the energy equation?
Yeah, well, this has got to be reciprocal value is critical. So if we can get better access to micro generation, to what the actual demand profiles of individual vehicles, now we're going to have energy capacity moving itself around the country in ways that we can't really predict right now. And that will have a very material bearing on how to balance the grid at the high level and present lots of different opportunities and challenges for everybody in the whole value chain. And this is where we really see it as not as a supply chain. It's a value chain where once you've supplied some information and someone's consumed it and used it, they also generate derivative information which gets fed back into the other end of it. So really it's much more web-like in its instantiation, and I'd certainly hope that as we go through this and the interest we've already had from organizations like Schneider, there's going to be a lot of value here to unpack for everyone. And so part of the reason as well for getting everybody in the same room is a lot of commercial value in here, and to unpack that in a way that people don't feel disenfranchised or that they're going to lose some kind of competitive advantage. There's also, you said, transport is a bit anarchic. There's a process of creative destruction in the middle of this, which is best managed by everybody leaning in rather than creating more noise at the edges. And that's part of our role here is to be the icebreaker. Yeah,
it sounds like a really interesting people process in there. So talking about bringing things together, another interesting question from Paul. So he's asking about both OSDU and Open Footprint, collaborative initiatives to share data across the energy industry. How do you see yourselves align with those strategic data sharing and standardization programs?
I think, I don't know the detail of those specific programs, but what I'd say is there are hundreds of programs for building data hubs and portals and data sharing and so on and so forth. I think it's really just let's all get in touch and make sure that we're all pointing in the same direction. If we end up with open standards at the end of this for the interoperability and cohesion across the market, then everybody wins. I can say, speak very personally, I'm not interested in reinventing any wheels. So if there's anything Paul or anyone else knows about that we don't know about, please let us know. My email address is on the screen. We're just really keen to connect to existing prior work. You'll have seen in the presentation, there was the thing that we're doing that was new in open energy was mapping into the sector. There weren't any particular technical innovations that had to happen in there. It's very much a cultural process of how can we get people together and get them collaborating, and kind of breaking through. The breakthrough moments are when everybody says, let's do it this way. So it's more of a process than a technology.
Yeah, and I guess also is it a bit of a mindset, because thinking about sort of just building onto another question of mine. So I tend to get interested in information security, but from its widest perspective. And one of the risks to be aware of is aggregation risk. Now, clearly, you mentioned earlier on about the, if you like, the direct security risks to some of the data sets, but what's the thinking behind just getting security minded enough to think about, actually, if this data set was combined with that one and that one, then somebody might be able to do something a bit more interesting.
So I think this is a really interesting question, a really interesting tension. So we had really good conversations with the CP&I during the work here looking at protecting our national infrastructure. I think there's a lot of debate about whether open is more secure than closed, or and so on. I certainly think that data aggregation, that's where you have a single point of weakness when you aggregate. So what are your attack vectors into where the aggregators are? I think here one of the upsides of having a highly fragmented and distributed data ecosystem with a permission layer that can be controlled is you keep most of the data at the edge, and it only needs to be combined when it needs to be used at one level. So we might find, we don't know, but we might find as we go through this that certain types of data or certain types of analysis should only be done at the point of rendering, or if you like, at the point where the decision needs to be made, and nothing stored. And I think this infrastructure approach, where you're managing the controls effectively, gives you that option. Whereas if you aggregate everything into one place, you don't have that option. Now, having said that, we're also working with Edinburgh University. They've got a system there, a new initiative called the Global Open Finance Centre of Excellence, which is a long name, but they're aggregating data in the financial sector for millions or hundreds of thousands at the moment of accounts on a weekly basis, and doing economic analysis across regions in the UK. That's a massive opportunity, and you do need to aggregate at that point. But that's within the National Data Safe Harbor. It's part of the National Supercompute Facility, and so on and so forth. So there you've got you need the investment in managing security at scale when we're talking about our national infrastructure. So I think that what we are hoping here is we can enable the permission to do that kind of aggregation, while for the smaller things, if you've got some smart startup that just says, actually, we think we could achieve X if we could just get access to this set of stuff for the next 30 minutes, great.
That's good. Now, so I think we're running out of time. So that's one question from Christine, coming in a second, and then I'll just do a final closing one here. But it's been a really interesting session so far. So Christine's posed interesting, she's put a bit of context in there, but we're then saying, if we wind back a little way into the way the energy industry used to be, where we had single nationalised industries representing different parts of it, and you mentioned there that very complex ecosystem, would we have been in a better place if we'd got those single sort of monolithic nationalised entities?
That's a great question. Let me reflect on, so I still work on the open finance work with the Financial Conduct Authority. One of the recommendations that we arrived at through that group, just looking at how might we apply principles of open banking into pensions, for example, is don't set up a single body to do all of finance. Do set up an equivalent of the open banking trust for pensions. So have two different organizations whose job it is to sort out the sector, and then get them to work on the common rules. as we've demonstrated with energy, a lot of those rules translate and a lot of them don't. But you can't put the different sectors in the same room and expect them to all want to be in the same tent. Culturally, it's just not how we operate. Yeah, from if we were a dictatorship, then yeah, it'd be much easier. Lots of things would be easier if you dictatorship, but that's not how we operate. So the takeaway for me is you've got to allow diverse and disparate forces to go and do their own thing, and then work on how are we going to make that cohesive and interoperable.
Yeah, and if you've got that complex ecosystem, you actually have to work that bit harder to be a bit more visible that it is actually working.
Yes.
Talking about working is sort of my closing question, if you like, is 5 years from now, how would you see this will all be?
Well, within 5 years, we've got 100% of the banks and hundreds of fintech companies all plugged into a single way of sharing data. I'd love to see that not just across energy. I think we can do it 10 times faster and 10 times cheaper as well for the energy sector than banking took. I think there's an opportunity here that we could do it across all the clusters I mentioned within that time horizon. And certainly when we look at our overall overarching driver here to get to net zero, we kind of need to, because the infrastructure that we're going to build in the next 10 years is going to define and determine our country's carbon impact by 2050. Yeah, so we need to be, we're a bit late to that problem. So the faster the better. So, but I think here we've got a blueprint that could be copied and pasted. There's a huge amount of work to do under the hood, but the blueprint here, I think, is fit for purpose. And I encourage everyone to just lean in and say, how might this apply to the area that we're working in? And it's where there's those many-to-many relationships that I think this will be really most effective. And
also picking up your point there about not reinventing the wheel as well being key. If there's something you can borrow from and adapt, let's go for that. So yeah, anyway, so in the interest of time, that's been really, really interesting, really insightful. So thank you very much, Gavin, on behalf of the members. There was a question about slides and recording. So the recording of the event will be going up on the BCS member group's YouTube channel. It normally takes a few days for the processing to go through to get it to a point where it's uploaded. But yes, all the video will be there, complete the Q&A and everything. So yes, it'll be available shortly. And then just finally from me, just a quick reminder, our next webinar is on the 18th of March, 12:30, when we've got Keith Dran from NHS Digital talking about data in social care. So that looks to be another really fascinating session. But just once again, I'd like to thank Gavin on your behalf. So thank you, Gavin. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everyone.